So I tend to believe that the political process plays out on this tapestry of social changes and trends, much longer and larger lasting than the results of any one election or election season. Now, it's easy for many to pretend that they're above politics or that the messy and often ugly world of politics has very little impact on their lives. And yet the evidence surrounds us, proving that the political process ultimately has everything to do with our society's future. And I think we ignore this evidence at our peril. Now, based on the recent election results in Washington state, I'd estimate that about 40% of the state's voting population, they can't even be bothered to pick up a pen and fill in one of the ballots that are conveniently sent to their home. And as a plurality or kind of a block of voters, this number of apathetic exceeds the Democrats or the Republican voter blocks. Now, that apathy continues either because they don't believe their vote counts, or they just don't believe that elections produce consequences that matter. Or perhaps just the daily drama of life just engulfs and it smothers whatever civic engagement that they might feel obligated to perform. Voting is just so meh. But unfortunately, elections do have consequences, or more precisely, the decisions made by those who are elected, and those people that we put into office, those have consequences for sure, and those impact us all, whether we want to pretend that they do or not. Like the expanding crime wave, the escalating cost of living, the decreasing value of our dollar, our ability to live safely in our homes, or the distant drums of war, or the very close evidence of the failure of our young students to understand basic math. And these are all real-life, impactful results of political policy decisions that have occurred over the years, and we suffer the consequences now. So these things matter. They matter whether you believe elections do or not. Of course, nobody in political office is willing to take credit for those outcomes, and yet the historic decisions made by our political class have dumped these consequences upon us. And ultimately, it won't really matter who we blame. We all get to suffer the consequences and pay the price for the electoral mistakes of the past and the present. Now, I tend to avoid repeating the narrative that this is the most consequential election ever, right? Because everyone is. And I suspect that it's a challenge to live your life always concerned about surviving the next apocalyptic, politically induced doom scenario. This becomes exhausting and emotionally taxing for most people. And in truth, the doom is rarely as bad as forecasters predict, and nor is the political class as capable of avoiding disaster as they want us to believe. Sometimes it's perfectly reasonable and rational, actually, to prefer a kind of blissful ignorance and a you only live once approach to life. As an alternative to stress or drama, this actually makes perfect sense. However, there are consequences to every decision, and the results of elections have consequences as well. Unlike the personal decisions that we might make that impact those around us and our family, the electoral consequences, those impact everyone in our community and our nation. So judging by the average mindset, the attachment to reality, or just a willingness to connect with average people by our political class, in Washington state, I can appreciate that optimism is difficult to maintain without kind of a liberal dosage of maybe alcohol or prayer or the unshakable ability to look on the bright side of life. I'm naturally an optimist, and obviously, because that's what allows me to be engaged as an activist for so long. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe that I can make a difference. I also aspire to have the ability to encourage others to also engage collectively in an effort to kind of produce individual activism, coordinated or not, which could help bend the arc of history closer to freedom and liberty where I want it than it appears currently to be directed. So my optimism, of course, is just challenged and sometimes shaken when I see so clearly the inevitable ugly results of political decisions, those elections, and the harmful policy choices that result from those. The worst of these results are typically shifted into the future, which almost guarantees that by the worst choices made by policymakers and politicians of today, that those always impact the greatest and produce the most harm for those generations of tomorrow, long after it's possible to hold those in our political class most accountable for the harm that they've inflicted on all the rest of us. And we are all blessed, or more often burdened, by those who have long left political office, and it's very difficult to hold them accountable. So the recent election results indicate an apparent willingness to pile up more of these negative consequences, even more for our future selves. Not in every instance, of course, but from a general trend perspective, we the governed have really not sent a strong message to change course. Maybe to tap the brakes just a little bit. But generally, the societal descent continues, and a precious few holding political office are going to be willing to change the course that we're currently on. Now, at some point, and I really can't believe that it's too far away from today, I suspect even the apathetic will wake up. I can't predict that date, but I do suspect that we'll all know when we hit that political wall. True political change is inevitable at some point, and at some point in time, even if something can't continue, it usually won't. But how much does the rule of law collapse before then? How many more victims of crime do we need to have in our communities in the meantime? How much political corruption and incompetence are actually we willing to accept and, in some cases, even celebrate? How bloated and wasteful must government become? And how far will we allow our cities to decay? How long will we pretend our public schools are doing an even marginal job, supposedly educating the children? And what is our tolerance for the societal decay, the collapse, the disintegration that we see all around us today? I actually can't answer these questions for you. And I'm sure that I can't answer them for the apathetic who don't even think it's worthwhile to vote. It's too much bother. Now, when enough people wake up, it'll dawn on enough of them, I think, that there's no longer room for this blue team, red team obsessions or the distractions that kind of come along with it, because we've seen things change before. I believe Scott Walker had a real impact in Wisconsin. Another example that I witnessed personally was Rudy Giuliani confronting the collapse of New York City, where I lived as a student. And clearly Ron DeSantis is making Florida a better place than it was before his tenure there. Washington State, my home, is going to descend a little bit lower into the harmful consequence pit of just this one party ruling and grifting for so long. And I don't think this can be avoided right now, at least not for a few more years. So regardless of the number of Republicans elected in our state this election cycle, it isn't going to be enough to completely arrest that descent, but they can probably have an impact on the margins to reduce or delay the harm. However, to even have that limited impact, it still will take bravery and spines, both of which are rare and precious commodities in a partisan political class that is plagued oftentimes with self-doubt and fear. More importantly than a minority rearguard action to kind of protect us from the harm that the dominant political class enjoys inflicting on the rest of us, we must recognize the critical obligation we have to build up a future cohort of capable servant leaders willing to confront and reverse this descent into fiscal and policy madness. Now, it's rare to see people like this just suddenly appear on the scene. We'll need to grow and probably train them. And a failure to grow these future positive political leaders only ensures the current descent continues, or at least it's harder to slow down. So let's talk some specifics about the recent elections in Washington State, because just like Arizona, California, Nevada, Washington State has this regressive election system that only gets worse as the years go by. Somehow, decades before Washington became the 42nd state in the Union, America was able to process national elections, and they knew the results very quickly, usually within days. I mean, counting ballots by candlelight before electricity was even invented or discovered. Even in the midst of a continent-wide civil war in the 1860s, America could conduct accurate elections in just days. But with the election progress that we have today, it takes weeks, maybe even months, to know the result of the people's will on who will be our next elected officials, and that's just in our state. To those who can manipulate and profit from this incompetence, that I'm sure it probably seems great to you, however, let's not pretend that it is normal or even adequate for a modern industrial society. One of the reasons ballot counting is slow right now is because the Secretary of State's centralized signature verification database has crashed, and it's currently bogged down so much that they can't even process the ballots in a timely manner. This is just one of the many failed legacies of same-day voter registration, which was a political decision made exclusively by Democrats back in 2018, and it's cascaded into this multiple policy fiascos that we're unfolding and witnessing today. Most people don't even know this is going on. Now, this is just the joys of voter centralization, which means we no longer have 39 counties who process their own ballots and can put up results quickly, because they all have to check in with the centralized voter database. But at least in a more distributed model like that, we could have had most of the counties counted. Well, maybe King County just went out there and floundered around. Instead, it only takes a computer crash in Olympia or Seattle to shut the entire state down, while we aspire to produce an election result at least as quickly as the purple-thumbed Afghanistan, kind of in between the Taliban rule, or even just Brazil, India, or Zimbabwe. Instead, we get to observe the spectacle of weeks of fumbling, confusion, and drama. So the third world should be mocking Arizona, Washington, and California, and the other states in America that seem to believe that what we're currently witnessing in our election process is progress. For the regressive progressives out there, let me be clear, and perhaps I'm the first to tell you this, but a bogged down, fiasco of an election system is not progress. An election system that takes longer to process than what our founding fathers accomplished every 2 years, 150 years ago, by candlelight and horseback, even in the middle of a civil war, is actually a regression and it's decay. It isn't better, and only a lefty would consider it progress. It is absurd, it's silly, and an embarrassment to all but the most corrupt. So, days after the election has passed, I have no idea what the final results are right now, and neither do you. If a candidate's leading by more than 10% or so, they probably won in most cases. If the initial result shows a margin closer than 5%, there's no way you can be sure. If the trend count over the next few days tightens a race, and hold off on popping those corks in the champagne for a few weeks, because just like the tortoise and the hare, the election really isn't over yet. Now, worse than that, if it looks like your candidate is just barely ahead, beware of the secret stash of ballots in King County election workers' car trunks, or suddenly discovered in a secret stash room at the post office. And these are all special surprises that can change the outcomes dramatically. And these can only happen when you create an election fiasco that's the current Washington state election system. And seriously, I oftentimes feel like I'm part of a Monty Python skit when I try to figure out how screwed up these guys really are. We've traveled down a long yellow brick road of political promises that's been paved with our tax dollars, billions of them, to get to this place. And if this is the promised land of modern elections, then we could do better if we just brought back the pencils, candlesticks, and horses. It's no wonder that an increasing number of people just don't trust the clowns behind the curtain. And it's easy to mock them. They don't care. Plenty of insiders profit from the fiasco, the confusion, and the drama. And those who profit, they're going to protect the clowns who help them. So I'll do my best to give you a more detailed update on the election results next week, after we count another 1 million ballots or so. That's presuming our Secretary of State systems don't just continue to keep crashing and failing. I'm sure we'll know what happened eventually. Now, for those who bothered to vote, thank you. It really does matter. For those who helped on political campaigns supporting freedom and liberty, thank you. I don't know how much it matters yet, but we can probably figure it out by Thanksgiving if we're lucky. For those who helped the lefties, the insiders, the grifters, and cronies, I hope you adjusted your payment to accommodate the escalating inflation, and I hope it was worth it for you. For those who love liberty and freedom, we have our work cut out for us. Nobody promised it'd be easy, but we have to engage. We're not alone. There are millions of people out there just like us who are willing to make an impact, willing to engage, and willing to fix what's broken. We can't afford to presume somebody else is going to do it for us, because they won't. It's up to us to fix it. Because the future does belong to those who show up. Stick with me and we'll keep showing up together.